We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Roth-Gushel.
All right, we're going to continue off where we finished with our previous part one discussion, ringing in 2023, 3 weeks after the fact, ringing in 2023 with our potpourri of...
a post-New Year prospective.
There you go. Yeah, post-New Year perspective, tangents and all. We're going to continue on with what we discussed, and we were getting back to, at the end of part one, we were getting back into the elements of the nature of the new Congress with a particular focus on Matt Gaetz. And also, I had mentioned some information regarding some of the members of the new Congress, like Scott Perry, and I'll have links in our show notes with sources regarding those some of the things I mentioned at the beginning of part one. But we're going to have a focus here, particular focus that you had pointed out to me, Jeremy, and then I got to listen to parts of it. I think you might have finished the whole thing. It was Matt Gaetz on the TimCast with Tim Pool and Ian Crossland and Luke We Are Change, Radowski and crew, and some of the things that you had picked up on with Matt Gaetz being like the firebrand of the new Congress, like what I almost see there's a bit of like a power play going on with like the ensuring of, almost as if it was like an ensuring of certain people would be in certain positions as far as these various committees, the Oversight Committee, for example, or Homeland Security, and it would identify this interview, and Gaetz is like this firebrand and a bit of a pincher movement almost, where Matt Gaetz is still appealing to like the outsider MAGA types, and then Marjorie Taylor Greene has kind of been inserted into like this more establishment friendly area with like a bit of like a rebranding of her now. She's not the even though her rhetoric hasn't changed. I mean, that's important to point out that Marjorie Taylor Greene's rhetoric hasn't changed, and the way she talks about her real and perceived political rivals hasn't changed. But there has been this bit of a makeover of where she's no longer in some circles the QAnon adjacent nutcase who's talking about no planes hitting the Pentagon and about Rothschild Jewish space beams, but now she's more respectable, and she supported McCarthy and was against the circus that took place and all of this. So now I think this is like a kind of seems like maybe a controlled pincher move with Gaetz being like the voice of the outsiders who don't have access to the GOP establishment. And as we've pointed out, as I've been saying for a couple of years now, we're moving towards a GOP where the Marjorie Taylor Greenes would become the norm rather than the exception. I think we're seeing that play out right this moment. But there's still this appearance of like, we're the outsiders, and Matt Gaetz is kind of appealing to that. And we picked up on a few themes in this TimCast interview with Matt Gaetz and he's very effective, I think. I'll let you get in a couple of things you noticed about this, Jeremy. But I mean, Gaetz he's an articulate and effective voice for some type of, I think, pseudo populism, but some type of the ultra MAGA on steroids. Going back to the Madison Cawthorn term that with appeals to like what elements of what could be considered, at least in a vacuum, genuine populist policy pushing and whatnot. Not that I'm saying it's going to be, but at least like the appearance of it and certain willingness to work with people on the other side, quote unquote. And so I'll let you. We'll start talking about some of the things we noticed from this Matt Gaetz Tim Pool interview, which I do think is directed at almost like a layout of like what to expect to this TimCast audience, which does see itself of being outside of what someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene's trying to appeal to now.
Yeah, I would first echo these points that you made already. Actually, that it actually was what I had suspected was basically Matt Gaetz proved true during that interview in terms of this inside-outside game that Gaetz and the quote-unquote Freedom Caucus were playing in relationship to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene as a conduit to the quote unquote establishment types like McCarthy, and basically Gates basically said, yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's still my woman. She's the most courageous member of Congress that I know. We're in this together, and basically admitting that they did play a political pincher move. And it was sort of obvious on the surface of it. And you're right. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene has not changed her rhetoric, while they've also cleansed her with her QAnon Jewish space lasers apology tour or something like that. And she's also she seems to be sort of doing makeup in a new way, and so it's obvious that like there has been a decision made, and she's gone along with it to now sort of escalate her into the establishment as sort of the insider outsider game, while the people like Gates continue to play the role of the actual quote unquote outsiders. And
Who hasn't been fooled by online memes in their younger days
their
about
younger days.
about planes at the Pentagon or space beams? Who hasn't been fooled by these things at a younger
My
age? And
my yoga
I
instructor
was only 40.
boyfriend was giving
I
me
was
all
only
these
in my early
memes.
40s when all this happened. It's
If
interesting.
only I'd known my main hot dog eating man, Luke Radowski. I've heard Bannon likes him as his main anarchist go to. Now he's my main hot dog date man.
One thing I was just going to point out about on this note, since we mentioned it, was the way he was talked about. Like there are clips of Sean Hannity giving her a very, very friendly interview recently, and then 2 years ago, Hannity railing against her conspiracy theories while also running cover for her in the operation around her by saying, "No real conservative I know subscribes to any of these beliefs." It's just an example of like the washing of her. Meanwhile, like she'll give these half-hearted, not even, I don't think, serious apology tours about the space beams and the Pentagon and all, and harassing families. I didn't actually harass them, but whatever. To now, while the rhetoric doesn't change, the washing of her, and I think so. I was just throwing that out there as like one of the specific examples of that. But anyway, go
And
on.
remember, by the way, that the only sort of credible time that I've heard in terms of like media that has gone public at a high level, where the whole question of the January 6th backpack bomber question has ever even been asked was Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so it looked like very architected and scripted in terms of their denial of her. It was something about I would never be caught in a wardrobe like that. I think and Gates backed her up on that or something like that. That was the denial of it. So that just that popped in my mind. I'm not making much of it, but it's an interesting piece there that their relationship in terms of media play goes way back actually. And I think you're also very correct in terms of Gates. It's really stepping very fluidly into this role as this articulate spokesman for now it's been called, really the populist right, right? And that's the other major talking point that Gates seemed to be making during the Tim Pool interview was talking about the populist right and the populist left and bringing them together to face down the establishment. And so, in a certain way, you just begin to hear recapitulation of the 2016 election and the sort of the MAGA sort of jilted Bernie Bro alliance that we now know was actually an epicenter of some of the information warfare that was deployed against the 2016 election and the American people. We now know that was part of what was not only Cambridge Analytica's focus on disaffected Bernie Sanders voters in relationship to, at the very least, getting them not to vote for the Democratic ticket in 2016, but even sort of shifting them into the Trump sphere. But you also then see the Israeli connection there and Joel Zamel and the incoming of Psy Group and other potential Israeli Psy war contractors being sort of set up to dovetail, as Seth Abramson might say, with the Putin operation that was going on in terms of focusing on a combination of three sets of voters in terms of the information warfare. One was the aforementioned disaffected Bernie Bros, disaffected for good reason, I would say, in terms of the apparent, shenanigans, potentially stealing of the primaries in 2016 on the Democratic side of things, and then also suburban women, suburban white women. I think it was actually specifically talked about, and then African American voters in general. And you see, in general, like even beyond just sort of like the voting in 2016, you see very serious media landscape and even narrative landscape success in terms of those information operations. I would say very likely ongoing. That's what the Jimmy Dore sort of, quote unquote dirtbag left hole scene really begins to look like, as the mouthpiece, as the spokespeople for the disaffected Bernie bro aspect of that. And now then there's intersections, and now with you have Trump showing up at the funeral of which one is it, Diamond, or
Diamond, yeah.
of Diamond and Silk. Uh,
Yeah.
these are my black women's, and these are the best of my black women's, and all that. And he's there just smiling away at the funeral. And so there are these very interesting intersections of that deployed information
Right.
warfare aspect that's in the background now of someone like Matt Gaetz coming up. He looks and he acts like some kind of like sort of snooty, snotty frat boy, but he talks like some kind of firebrand populist with strong inside game political chops.
I was going to mention, you mentioned the disillusionment with the whole Bernie bro scandal and all of that, and it's interesting. I thought of Steve Bannon directly. He said on, I've heard him like on a number of occasions when I've actually tuned into the War Room podcast on multiple occasions, refer to bringing the deplorables and the Bernie bros together for a real like economic nationalism. And so that right there is directly said by that. And it's interesting that Matt Gaetz does seem to be I mean, my impression is that Matt Gaetz is Steve Bannon's go-to congressman at this point. So I mean that makes sense. And now Gaetz is picking up on like the working with the other side on these populist policies, and I mean it makes a lot of sense.
And now Matt Gaetz has become the announced favorite politician, at the very least, announced favorite Congress member of the Tim Pool show. They basically said that, and now there's been evolution on that over the last year. At first, like MTG, that was their girl, dude. They loved her. She would kick it with them, and then they moved to Carrie Lake. Carrie Lake. I still think Tim Pool really has a thing for Carrie Lake. He was saying she should be the next president, but obviously she's not in the Congress, so their new go-to is Matt Gaetz. And it was interesting watching him with very obvious, very strong media training, be very smooth in the way that he seemed to not duck questions, but he redirected a whole bunch. And as I pointed out in our last recording very briefly, he was very quick to try to interject and almost tried to interrupt Ian Crossland in bringing up the problem, the potential problem that they've been talking about, especially Ian, but also a little bit of Luke, talking about the dangers of what's being proposed by the Freedom Caucus types in terms of government commissions. And remember, like when I, spoke with Ron Paul on C-SPAN, Morning Journal or whatever it's called, back, I think it's probably
Washington Journal.
Washington Journal, thank you, back in maybe 2012, 2013, and brought up some of the neocon and Zionist networks surrounding the move to war in Iraq, but also 9/11 specifically. And he went straight to, well, he was about to try to do this thing with the Giuliani thing where he was like denouncing the 9/11 truthers who supported him, that kind of thing. Remember that at the debates and in the 2008 election cycle. But he then sort of stopped himself and said, "Well, I don't have the information that the caller has in terms of these kinds to make these kinds of assertions, but I do know that his point that deception sort of historically is what helps take us to war. And then I also know that I don't trust government commissions." And this is the point that they're then re-rolling out in terms of the Tim Pool show is like is it even worse to have a government commission about something that we might want to, for example, sort of big tech or big pharma or the intelligence agencies? Is it even worse to just even have a commission that's run by our quote unquote allies, the Freedom Caucus and their committees in Congress, than nothing at all because it actually makes it seem to the people that we've had the whole truth, the final truth, and nothing but that, you know. And so that point was being brought up, and then Ian Crossland goes into for example, the NIST investigation, the National Institution of Standards and Technologies investigation into the World Trade Center, and you hear Matt Gaetz being like, "Yeah, this is exactly the." And so you can tell this is very, very dangerous terrain for someone like Matt Gaetz. And Ian Crossland successfully continued and actually made the point about the NIST investigation into 9/11. And then Gaetz then immediately goes back to the point that he was trying to interrupt with. It was this, of course, is the Saudis' playbook. And I will just point out again that once you deal with the actual, physics and common sense logic of ground zero investigation in terms of September 11th, there is another government in the Middle East who's surrounding players, some of them arrested on the day of, others where there's actually, maybe much more clandestine evidence suggesting pointing in their direction in terms of the whole network that set up the real estate transfer surrounding Silverstein and Frank Lowy of Westfield Mall fame. And then you've got to deal with Lauder and Eisenberg and this whole crew there at the epicenter of the
Michael Glassner.
Michael Glassner, another crucial figure that we focused on for a few years during the Trump years, who became he was actually in charge of the Trump campaign during the 2020 cycle, I think.
Southwest coordinator of APAC. Also, I believe involved with Sarah Palin, I believe. And he had a background with Bob Dole.
Yeah, he starts his political career out of KU, out of the University of Kansas, and this whole Dole network and the Dole Institute network. And that's where we sort of originally began to get, focused on him as he showed up at this post-election conference at the Dole Institute in 2016. And so then, yeah, he then moves from this working closely with Dole and those politics into even sort of more wide-ranging national politics, and goes into, like you pointed out, he was in charge of Southwest APAC for a while, but he was also Louis Eisenberg's deputy at key times and key companies during the real estate transfer of the Port Authority of New Jersey, New York. They're overseeing some of the remaining World Trade Center real estate into the private, quote unquote, privatized hands of Silverstein and Lowy. And of course, Lowy is, he's a Australian Israeli, but he's of course, and he has this background as Israeli military. And then you have Silverstein talking to Netanyahu every Sunday. Silverstein involved in these real high-powered Jewish organizations with a very strong focus on Israel and all that. And when you combine that with the actual physics investigation that Ian Crossland was pointing out that the NIST had covered up, then you begin pointing directly at this other country in the Middle East, not Saudi Arabia. You start pointing the finger at Israel, and so Gaetz seems to be very there's at the very maybe the whole topic of 9/11 is taboo, but I also got the sense the way that he didn't sort of say or try to actually change the topic like he did when Luke at another time brought up the Epstein scandal as a potential issue of unity amongst the entire political spectrum, let alone the populist left and the populist right. And Gates spun it into an entirely different subject. This was different. Gates spins it into this is the Saudis' playbook, and sort of just spins it into sort of standard, money and lobbying political power in D.C., which was also one of the themes of it, to sort of like write it as we're the outsiders trying to overthrow the big money of the establishment. And so in a certain way it really just everything that we heard in the framing of Trump, as if this billionaire real estate developer, as we pointed out in the circles with the 9/11 real estate guys from way back in the circles, one of the best buds for at least a good few key years there of the Epstein network, and then also down in Florida, and still hooked up with Epstein and the whole property dispute that ultimately Trump wins, and then more than doubles his money selling it to this crucial Russian sphere fertilizer oligarch Rybolovlev, whose private plane followed the Trump campaign around during the 2016 campaign season. And then to paint that kind of guy who is also then buttressed by the top level of New York public relations, that tying in, of course, to the evil liberal New York Times, Maggie Haberman, quote unquote anti-Trump scenario. Her family involved in the firm that was the go-to of defending Trump of his decades of scandals in New York, putting aside the whole Roy Cohn background there. And so the selling of this kind of guy as an outsider, as a populist, as an everyday man, for the working man in the middle of the country. That's what we're seeing the next generation, the version 2, I think, of that coming into focus now, and it's got this very very Floridian centric aspect. So of course you got the Trump Florida aspect. They're moving it down from New York to Florida. And remember, Luke Radowski himself during the COVID era goes from being a lifelong New Yorker after his family had moved to the United States to becoming a Florida citizen of Florida. And so then you have DeSantis in the mix, Gates, Florida in the mix. And with Florida, you're really talking about one of the long-term epicenters, of course, of Zionist influence, of organized crime, of some of the top aspects of U.S. special forces. Remember, even like Alex Jones on George Norrie doing this big not mea culpa, but sort of admitting that he was like Alex Jones admitted to doing 11/9 in many ways. The most frontal he was about it was on George Norrie, where he said that he was a special forces group. His friends in special forces brought to him the fact that Donald Trump was the last potential savior of the American Republic. And this special forces group he identified operates out of Florida, too. And so there's a whole piece there that as they're moving the power sphere into Florida, I think, where it's also been set up for the libertarian right folks, the sort of Dave Smith type folks who will be in the mix in the coming presidential election. That's their also positive trigger point, is DeSantis's anti overreach COVID policies too. And so that's a key piece of this. And we were just chatting before, Greg, and this would be the last thing that I talk about, that there's a real key piece here in terms of Florida and DeSantis, in that he not only said that this is where woke comes to die in terms of winning his second round as governor, but his one of his very first acts, his first after first winning the governorship, was passing very very severe anti-boycott divestment sanctions laws, and I believe he was also similar to people like governors like Eric Greitens in Missouri, and actually doing a trip to Israel, hooking up with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu praised them and all of this, and so that whole horseshoe of the culture war, and I would say the terror war. That's what anti-BDS is really about in some ways, is a buttressing of the terror war aspect. But we're going to really see the nature of the logic of this rhetoric of the sort of the culture warrior and the terror warrior coming together in the political geography of Florida, and specifically someone like DeSantis.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This also, I think, where what you're talking about here with DeSantis and the long term, uh, Florida is this long term sell basically for like these mafia Zionist operations. I think this could dovetail pretty well with some shows that Robbie Martin did for Media Roots Radio, who has been Abby, Robbie Martin, Mike Preisner have been doing their own research into Ron DeSantis. And I think from what I've seen, the research is very valuable. There's some areas and some conclusions that they come to that we don't quite agree with them on, but nonetheless, the information, and part of that is Robbie Martin through Media Roots has been doing his own investigations, like into the long-term history of Disney, and these would actually, I think, dovetail pretty well into John Swinn's long-term of course, his series of long-term documentation of the unauthorized story of the American century. And Robbie Martin, he focuses on something also that Swinn is focused on, I think, from a bigger general lens of the role of long-term of Disney in Florida, and Ron DeSantis waging the war against woke Disney, but Disney's long-term stand in Florida as this of propping up and promoting and going in line with what you might call military-industrial complex advancing of agendas. So that, I think, dovetails what you're talking about here with this long-term Florida as this station for these Zionist mafia type operations that now guys like DeSantis and Matt Gaetz do seem to be very, I would say, I think especially we look at Matt Gaetz and his scandals that are out there of stories about him, and then tying into like the Roger Stone affiliate elements of these mafia operations that do appear to be pretty tied into a relatively significant level. Obviously, DeSantis heavily into, and Matt Gaetz doesn't appear to be too far off ultimately.
No, and I second your urging people to go listen to Media Roots Radio take on Disney, DeSantis, Florida, especially in conjunction with John Swinn's sort of much more macro, longer term, and I would say even deeper research and analysis in his unauthorized the, history of the American century, and because it really puts it into a much bigger light, I think, in terms of what's going on here, and the very likely false dialectic of the anti-Disney, anti-woke DeSantis, and then Disney itself, and this comes in again in terms of the role that then Tim Pool not only is playing but proclaims to be playing in many ways, where he continues to be this sort of arbiter of this beef war in the new right, all quote unquote alternative media between Steven Crowder and the Daily Wire. And the way specifically that Tim Pool draws it out is that Daily Wire is attempting to be he calls it our Disney. Like they're trying to compete with Disney, which is then sort of seen to be sort of the establishment left woke media empire, and that he supports at the very least Daily Wire trying to give a quote unquote us a spot at the culture war table in terms of media power, while then also saying that I've gone the independent route myself. I think as many people as possible should go the independent route, and Steven Crowder is he sort of proclaims him like the Alex Jones of the culture war, is the way that I hear him talking about it, while I'm sort of trying to maintain the this sort of diplomat position in the middle of this beef by going on and having Candace Owens, which she talks sort of some pretty major trash about Steven Crowder, and then Steven Crowder will be on Tim Pool, I think, on tomorrow, Monday, and so that whole idea of Disney, and we need our own Disney, then running in the mix here, is a crucial point, actually, as we'll begin to see, especially in terms of when we look at what exactly Daily Wire is doing and the kind of information and conversations that they are highlighting, way beyond Candace Owen and her relationship with her good friends, both Ye and then Marissa Straight, the now CEO of PragerU, which is part of the Daily Wire Plus
Yeah.
community. Marissa Straight being a Unit 8200 Israeli NSA veteran officer, I guess.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to this. We're going to come back to Daily Wire here in a few minutes. We're going to be talking quite a bit about the, once again, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu interview with Jordan Peterson for Daily Wire Plus. That was very telling, maybe the most telling of the Netanyahu interviews we've watched and listened to and covered here in the past few months on The Antidote, while he made his tour prior to and after post, once again, becoming a prime minister. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but that interesting relationship, the dual relationships that Candace Owens has with Ye and with Marissa Straight, which is probably pretty instructive in and of itself. And we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But on the Gaetz thing, the other thing I wanted to point out, Jeremy, is that I had both you and I had picked up on Matt Gaetz mentioning the bipartisan, the name rattling off bad bipartisan consensus policy agreements of the past couple of decades. He mentioned the Iraq War, he mentioned the Patriot Act, he mentioned COVID lockdowns, and he also threw in printing money to give to people who don't want to work. And I mean, I think that might have been like a critique of the social safety net welfare state, you would call it, in general, or whether that was more or less like a post-COVID analysis of the stimulus checks that were sent to people in the aftermath. I'm not sure exactly what he was referring to there, but that, and then another moment where you had pointed out Social Security being referenced in relation to the FTX Sam Bankman-Fried scandal was indicative of perhaps another sign of an agenda that's going to be promoted and pursued in the new Congress.
Yes, and that was what Gates sort of sandwiched the question of of FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried in relationship to exactly what you're talking about, of like this idea of the sort of the welfare queen kind of dog whistling for the 21st century, where it's not as direct and as a potential attack on Social Security, it looks like, and then also then very media trained and actually sounding very much like what well trained politicians do. They'll ask you what you think of a certain issue to sort of get your sense of it before they give you their take on it. Well, so they're both acquiring information from their potential, at the very least, media constituency, while also sort of framing their answer to a way that you want to hear. And that was then specifically about, okay, FTX. What should we do about crypto, and all of that? But it was interesting, sort of seeing it sandwiched between what looks to be like this very old school, maybe Grover Norquisty kind of GOP, Newt Gingrichi kind of approach of an older school GOP to try to quote unquote privatize Social Security, basically probably gut Social Security in many ways, and then combined, sandwiched in with this, spinning of the FTX as some kind of just the woke liberal. This is what you get with ESG and impact investing and woke approaches to neoliberalism. That word, of course, is not never really used because then you're starting to get into the question of the Chicago School of Economics and the question of the libertarians and all of that. But yeah, that I thought that was very indicative of the id of the union of the McCarthy quote unquote establishment and then the quote unquote Freedom Caucus enjoinder in this new Congress.
Yeah, and I would mention there was a recent Gaslit Nation podcast with Sarah Kinzier and Andrea Chalupa with Gaetz mentioning like the whole wokeness and leftism of the FTX scandal. Reminds me of actually where evidence that points to Bankman-Fried and FTX actually holding back and keeping down what could be called actual quote unquote progressive candidates who had policies that were critical of that were opposite of the goals of the domestic Israel lobby. So that that might put a bit of a splinter into Gates's this is wokeness and all this in the way that a lot of the usual suspects want to portray that particular scandal.
Yeah, and if people want a real in-depth discussion of the sort of maybe some of the more macro context, including the question of crypto in a deeper fashion in relationship to the FTX scam, bank run, fraud scandal, might go to the Doom's Dungeon channel for the conversation between Seb Solomon and me, where we also discuss this question of where actually did the political money of FTX and Bankman-Fried go to, and it was always following APAC money and looked to be ferreting out, as you're talking about, the what would actually be called potential left upstarts in the Democratic Party. In full alignment with the APAC Democratic establishment, such as the new leader Hakeem Jeffries, very much a creature of APAC.
Right. And so what I thought of going back to this Gates and the particular line, it seems like with Social Security and so-called entitlement programs, safety net programs, it made me come back to this what I've talked about a little bit with regards to the right. I won't call it conservative movement because it's not conservative. I don't want to use that term. I think it's an insult to actual serious, true conservative ideals or beliefs that are still held by some people out there. But I think it's just been so weaponized and bastardized to such a level that I won't use that term anymore. But the controlled, you might call it the operative right wing, long term players here of a bit of a fusioning. And we've been talking about this with regards to the rise of Trump and the rise of MAGA and the more overt foreign influence to the Republican Party in particular, which has been something that has been, as we've talked about, has been brought about. The seeds have been planted for it for several decades, at least going back to the end of the Cold War period, where elements of American Council for National Policy, evangelicals, people like the now deceased Paul Weyrich and his ilk, were pushing for the United States basically to join with Russia as a Christian ally in terms of the fighting back against the policies of globalism and degeneracy, and hence where I think the culture war comes from by and large through that. But then in the past decade or so has become much more pronounced with the overt foreign influence, which I think ultimately brought us Trump and then I think a shifting from the previous class of Republicans. You mentioned like the Grover Norquist, maybe Newt Gingrich type of policy pushing. And of course, Gingrich is obviously a key player in the rise of MAGA from a quote unquote intellectual perspective. But going from that and the Congress of John Boehner, Paul Ryan, especially Paul Ryan, I think Koch, Heritage, think tank network economic policies. Now I think with Gaetz talking like this, emerging of that with the new quote unquote GOP of the overt culture warriors that are now, I think, with much more. We still have to put the pieces together of the direct evidence here, but we know obviously through Trump, and we know that there has been significant foreign increased significant foreign involvement and infiltration of the right wing CNP, all of their various networks that are affiliated with it. Obviously, this has been taking place. That is an undisputable fact. But then how much directly goes to specific members of Congress, I'm not sure. But obviously, the influence is there. So I think there's this merging now of the new GOP that's much more overtly fighting the culture war. I think the wars of actual domestic destabilization combined with these long-term economic policies that have been at play. And also, I won't risk stepping outside of my stepping outside of my stepping out of line, so to speak, out of turn, and talking about things that I'm not overly versed on. So I will leave the specifics of the economic discussion to other people who could, I'm sure, explain it better than me. But on a macro general level, it's an example, I think, of long-term economic policies merging with this new GOP. And so now it's I think the long-term dreams of the Koch heritage domestic policies are now merging with this very foreign, destabilizing centric new GOP. And I think Matt Gaetz directing the language the way he did towards the targeting of the safety net. And there's been other people saying it as well. Interestingly enough, once again, there's people who could explain it better to me. But Ron Johnson, now people are increasingly calling him Moscow Ron more and more. Ron Johnson up there in Wisconsin has been talked about as a person who has had targeting Social Security on his agenda table for several years now. And of course, he always denies it, but I mean, that's there. And it's interesting that he's one of the primary people I've heard his name mentioned with regards to that. So I do think that we are seeing this merging of the quote unquote old and new. And we're going to talk about, with relation to this Netanyahu interview and some things that we identified from that this is also going on a global level. But I think Matt Gaetz and what we heard on TimCast might just be one example of this merging of these long-term policies, then completely brought in with the destabilizing foreign elements that want to really use these meat and potato weaponized cultural issues as a means to just perpetuate as much destabilization as possible.
Definitely, and the question of the culture war as such is becomes more and more crucial, and that's what you really see. Like, sort of, Tim Pool seems to have a little bit now made a joke of his, talks about actual civil war in that way, and has now replaced that with, like, I want to be the hardest core culture warrior out there, independent, so I can, take up billboards that say such revolutionary radical things as Lynn Cheney is a pig or something like that, fat pig or something like that. I think that's his that's why he won't sign with groups such as, like, Daily Wire, because they would restrict his freedom to do such culture warrior frontal attacks, such as billboards like that. And more, what do we see? Like, the perfect example in many ways of what we have identified as this real twin pillar of political warfare in the 21st century, as the terror wars and the culture wars. Anybody who's trying to fight, I'd say, trying to win either one of those is a total dupe at best, or they become an agent of chaos. And the best example of that I can imagine is actually Tulsi Gabbard, right? Because that was, like, one of her main talking points before she really became, like, a full throated, like, Fox News sphere type, fully engaged publicly in the culture war, even though, like, her background always showed that she was engaged in a culture war from way back, in terms of her family's background and the Christian occult that she was involved in, and their relationship with cultural dynamics and all that. But the one thing that when she was running on her own terms, whether for Congress or when she was, then became a presidential candidate, was that she was a hawk on the terror war. She was just a anti-regime change war dove in many ways, right? And then just, a little bit after that, she then becomes a culture warrior too. She hasn't given up her terror warrior thing. She's just fully incorporated the next step of that. And so, once again, I think the Tim Pool show is a perfect example of that, at least on YouTube. Now they have their sort of behind a paywall conversations that are supposedly more radical and risque. Maybe they talk about things like 9/11, but I know they don't talk about 11/9. And so over and over again, I keep being reminded, and there's actually an escalation of the importance of I would say, the Achilles heels of both of these categories of political warfare of the global terror war and then the global culture war and all of the players and geopolitics that is implied in all of that are the Achilles heel are these events that represent really the capstone while also being the catalyst of these declared wars. One, the terror war, obviously 9/11. Then I would say the capstone of the culture war, at least in terms of our American context, is obviously 11/9 and what actually is going on around the entirety of the networks that help, install Trump into the White House. But more importantly, this much bigger narrative terrain of the MAGA movement and how it continues on in these kinds of figures of Matt Gaetz and these whole media terrains of the Tim Pool and how it all fits into Alex Jones and the Crowders and the Daily Wires and all of that. So these capstone events, these capstone, I would say, deep political events of 9/11 to 11/9 continue to be covered up, intensely so, and but also remain, I would say, the truth of which are their Achilles heels. If you want to deconstruct the negative influence and the political chaos dynamics of both the terror war and the culture war, you got to go to these instigating, originating events that are cloaked under hangout, limited hangout, and deception and red herrings. And so I'm more convinced than ever that actually the truth of these matters can really help to sway the political dynamic in terms of narrative. Now, and I'm not saying that we also then don't need to actually have political strategy because we do. And I don't yet see exactly how we have, at least in terms of electoral politics, how to cobble together some kind of way past our two-party impasse and all these fakers on the left and the right to proclaiming to be populist left and populist right who are almost to a one in denial of the full truths of both 9/11 and 11/9. But my sense more and more is that the truth, the deep truth of these matters is necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary to any political program moving forward. And everything that I'm seeing from the media landscape is just telling me that's true.
And this will serve to begin to transition us to the next thing that we're going to spend, I think, the majority of the rest of our time discussing here, going back to the merging and the fusioning of the culture war and the terror war on a global basis, and specifically in American domestic political context, but then also in a global context, especially when you bring in the the complicit foreign players in terms of Trump and the 11/9 moment and the the Red Sea conspiracy, as Seth Abramson calls it, and all of the geopolitics interconnected with that, and of course Brexit and a lot of other things we've seen play out. One of the things we've seen from this is we've been talking for several years about the neocon split between what we call the paleo neocons and the neo neocons, who deny that they're neocons. They're total hawks. They're total war hawks when it comes to the culture war on a global scale. And one example of
And
that,
they're also even more war hawks when it comes to questions of actually like attacking
yep,
Iran
yeah,
or
sure.
assassinating Iranian generals and all of that, or even in terms of like almost supporting the Russian war invasion of Ukraine.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And so they're bigger actual war hawks. Just of course, the difference is the idea of wars for quote unquote democracy and all the need for like American military boots to be on the ground all over the place. Outside of that, like it's like even like what we talk about Tulsi Gabbard, her rhetoric of I'm against regime change wars. When it comes to the war on terror as an idea and the actual, I think the actual at its core, the deep um, roots of like the war on terror at its most uh, hardline elements of it would be Tulsi Gabbard's much more of a representative of that than the Bill Kristol class of paleo neoconservatives who have effectively been purged out of the. I mean, they're really. I mean, even I think Liz Cheney losing her congressional seat in the primary is probably it might have been at least in terms of the GOP as we know it, the last one of the last vestiges of the paleo neocons being almost purged out, so to speak. And they may have a revitalization, maybe with a third party, or there will be another attempt to come back. I'm sure there will be, but as far as like the GOP of Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene pincher movement, like those figures are out, and that's been one of the consequences of this. And it has its, of course, positives, and I mean, but also had it was a blessing and a curse, whereas it became a curse, and that Donald Trump capitalized on the Bush dynasty and the paleo neocons very, very effectively, but then it became a curse, and that obviously it obfuscated what he himself was bringing about, as well as the people around him and the bigger operation that brought him in, which is even more hawkish, more hardline, much more hardline, uh, actual global terror war policy combined with the infusion of the global culture war. And I'm going to begin to transition here with Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson in Israel. And there was, I believe, was it Gadi Taub is the gentleman's name?
Yes, Gadi Taub. So that's
G A
G
D
A
I
D
T.
I T A U B. Yes.
Had mentioned during this clip that you had shared with me of mentioned particularly Francis Fukuyama, who's seen as one of the intellectuals of the paleo neocons, and that used him as an example. And Jeremy, I think I'm getting this correct. Used him as an example of how the paleo neocons, as we call them, did a Neville Chamberlain and capitulated to the global culture war. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. That's the way that, and Gaudi Taub is introduced by, I think, the president of this Tikva Foundation, which is the sponsor of this Daily Wire event of Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, both giving their own presentations and then being interviewed by Trump's Middle East envoy or ambassador to Israel. Is that right, Friedman?
Yes, David Friedman was the Trump bankruptcy attorney turned Trump organization, I believe, bankruptcy attorney turned ambassador to Israel. Yes.
And this is just the hardest real estate deal, and you will see too that in Netanyahu's conversation specifically with Jordan Peterson, which is separate from this Shapiro Peterson event in Jerusalem. I think it's in Jerusalem. That there is a lot of analogies being made to real estate and property holding, and who actually has the natural law backing for holding this property when you're talking about Palestine and Israel and all of that. But Gaudi Taub is then introduced by this Tikva Foundation uh, president, I think. And by the way, the Tikva Foundation, people should go look at that because that's a very interesting board there that includes a an Epstein lawyer, which people should do their research, like Luke Rudowski, might want to make points about the question of the Daily Wire and the hooking up with this Tikva Institute, and their be having a board member of a I think it's Jay Lefkowitz is the Epstein lawyer that's on the board of the Tikva Foundation. But then it's handed over to this Gaudi Taub, intellectual academic, and he really starts it by doing exactly what you're saying, Greg, by sort of highlighting Francis Fukuyama as this Neville Chamberlain neocon, almost like a dupe of history who thought that the West had won and there was not going to be any further attacks on the West in many ways, and little did they know that the attack on the Western values was actually going to come out of what's called human rights, right? And then he features an American writer and think tanker, John Fonte. That's JOHNFONTE, Hudson Institute affiliate in those circles, who he says understood that there was going to be an attack on our Western values under the guise of the question of human rights. And so Taub immediately brings up the question of the Durban conference, which is interesting. So you have pre 9/11, there's this big global NGO, so-called NGO event with all the activists, right, of the World Trade Organization in Seattle, the battle in Seattle, I think 2000 maybe, and a big deal, and somewhat representing an actual kind of populist left of spectrum, populist right alliance against global neoliberalist economic policies, many of which trace back to the Chicago School, which will come into focus in relationship to someone like Netanyahu specifically, and his military intelligence industrial base provided then free market driven approach to building Israeli power as a way to transcend the Palestinian question by building Israeli power. Remember also, I just think of the clean break paper, which we kept coming back to during the Trump years, especially. And that it's still to this day, like people who really should understand the nuance of policy dimensions and of detail. People like Ryan Dawson, for example, do not actually deal with what the clean break paper said. It said specifically in relationship to someone like Tulsi Gabbard and regime change war. The clean break doctrine called for regime change war in Iraq, and then destabilization, political warfare, rollback war in Syria. Mission accomplished, as we pointed out. And in certain ways, the United States played the bad cop in relationship to the Syrian government in terms of that dirty war in Syria that really did have its foundations. To me, it looks like there was actually uh, indigenous democratic uh, uh, eruption of wanted reforms in relationship to the Syrian government, which has a long history of being pretty brutal, and of course being one of the original black site partners for the United States government in its post 9/11 rendition program and black site program and all of that. So it is very clearly architected in the clean break paper of regime change war in Iraq and rollback war in Syria. And that's a really crucial thing to understand. Okay, because then you have the Russian government coming in and playing the good cop in relationship to the Syrian government, while also obviously asserting its military involvement in the region and recreating itself as a geopolitical force on the Middle Eastern scene, of which there's so much more surrounding that in terms of what we saw in terms of Trump and Netanyahu, the Abraham Accords, the Red Sea conspiracy, which is really, this is one thing I'll just point out so we don't forget it later. Netanyahu, in his interview with Jordan Peterson, admitted or sort of propounded upon the fact that the key moment of the Abraham Accords was when he came to the U.S. Congress in the face of the American president, Barack Obama, who he said he disagreed with ideologically, but, had his own principles. I just disagreed with his principles. Came to the U.S. Congress and advocated against the Iran nuclear deal. And then Netanyahu says that immediately after he started getting calls from the highest levels of Arab governments in terms of they were stunned that he was willing to do that against the American leadership, and they wanted to create partnership. And then Netanyahu says that in 2015, And then right after that, and people can go check this timeline, and Seth Abramson drew this out and was ridiculed by everyone from, MAGA Twitter to the, Russian state media, morning show fault lines as some kind of wacky conspiracy theorist for talking about the Red Sea conspiracy. And then Netanyahu says, yes, right after I came to the U.S. Congress, got these calls from the Saudi leaders. Then I am on, who knows where I am, but maybe I was on a yacht. Maybe I took a helicopter onto a yacht in the Red Sea against the wishes of my security people, and we had a meeting. And that's exactly what's described in terms of his key moment of the 11/9 operation, the Middle Eastern component of the 11/9 operation to not only help install Trump, who Netanyahu continues to, celebrate as a key backer of his Abraham Accord move, but it also tied the United Arab Emirati, the leadership and the Saudi leadership in through Israel and then back out to Putin, really, via the figure of someone like George Nader. And then that is also then the campaign that is then unleashed on the American people, too, in relationship to installing Trump. So back to the clean break paper. One thing that's talked about, and this is related to the way that Netanyahu talks in relationship to his military, industrial, intelligence-based focus of, peace through strength is the way he talks about. And this Talpiot program, the way that we analyzed it when he first went on the Mark Levin show and laid it out about how the Israeli technology could be spread, almost implied as a potential carrot and a stick in relationship to what would actually become diplomatic power. Security power, military power becomes economic power, becomes then diplomatic power that then will result, as Netanyahu said at that point, in the body of the General Assembly at the UN. But it also expresses itself in many other ways. But the word transcending the Palestinian conflict was also used in the clean break paper. So my sense is more and more is that Netanyahu is following the clean break paper, to large detail in many ways. But this Taub introduction to the conversation and the talks by Shapiro and Peterson is crucial because he sets up this dialectic of neocons, right? The paleo neocon Fukuyama is the Neville Chamberlain of the neocons. He thought history was over. He didn't anticipate the assault on Western civilization by this global woke left virtue signaling group. And then this second piece, remember the other piece, so you have the WTO right before 9/11, right after 9/11, or maybe it's in the year of 9/11, you have the Durban Conference, which is what Taub references as what the Hudson Institute, the good neocon, maybe the neocon, Fonte is referring to. And we'll print some of the papers and articles that Fonte wrote about at the time about the Durban Conference. And now Taub seems to be making a rhetorical move towards an American audience because he focuses on how the Durban Conference was all about criticizing American policing as potentially racially motivated, at the very least racially an inequity racially based in terms of American policing. And that was a part of the Durban Conference. But he leaves out in the beginning that another core piece of the Durban Conference was its anti-Zionism and the question of Zionism and racism. And so there's a lot of rhetorical kind of play going on here in terms of the way that this opening speaker makes his case, I think specifically for the Daily Wire's American audience.
It's interesting the pointing out of the way it was pointed out is like America has its own issues with race and racism and its own history and legacy with this. And it's interesting. It reminded me of how this part of maybe this another pincher cell that maybe the Daily Wire is a part of in terms of like this fusioning of the global culture war and this global hardline nationalist push that from more of an Israeli-centric direction to American Western audiences, as opposed to the also going on ongoing Russian-centric push for like this global nationalist culture war. That it reminds me very much of how the Russians or even Soviets historically have used the U.S.'s own legacy of Jim Crow and bigotry as a means to like don't talk about what other. I mean, it was an interesting parallel between how that's used, and it's used on multiple sides. Whereas Palestinian activists have paralleled the idea of what we call settler colonialism, and that this is inherent within both the American and Israeli experiments, and the American and Zionist experiments, and then it will be aforementioned the Russian element will use this as a means to be critical of America on a global stage. And we still see that playing out to this day with certain media and narrative dynamics, even going into current events over the last number of years, as we've talked about and other people have talked about. And then there's also even the push of almost the opposite of that would be the way like the other side to what might be called the alt-light here, even though I don't know if this is really alt-light all that much, so much in the way it's described as. But then there will be the other way of for me but not for thee, the people who say that, well, Israel can control its borders, but we can't, and we want to be like this. And so there's a lot of pointing out of hypocrisy and double standards, as it would be pointed out, to fit these certain narratives. And it was interesting to hear this from this pro-Zionist way of like, well, you can't talk about us at Durban because look at your own history. I thought that was interesting.
Definitely. And I think that there's again, come back to 9/11 and 11/9, and in this case, specifically 11/9, that even on the stage, that Taub was making this presentation here and proclaiming John Fonte as the real, you know, he wouldn't call him a neocon probably, but yeah, the real neocon, the non-Fukuyama neocon, is that they're part of this, the structure of this that actually shows there to be some kind of irony, but I would say actually hypocrisy at the core, that potentially points to a much larger narrative warfare component of even the nature of this event, is the fact that Ron Dermer was also a speaker and involved in this event there on the stage. And Taub, well, I'll get back well, let's discuss Dermer, Greg, in terms of what you noticed and that we should have been focusing on. That Dermer is the co-author, sort of similar like Michael Flynn writes his book right and publishes it right in the middle of the election season that helped install Trump, with his senior co-author, neoconservative Michael Ledeen.
Yes.
Now, Ron Dermer is the Michael Flynn to one Natan Sharansky in Sharansky's key books. The one about the reason, well, I forget the name of it, but about promoting democracy and nation building in the Middle East and all of that. But one thing I want to point out is that John Fonte, and Taub gets the name of his book a little bit wrong. The name of his book is called Sovereignty or Submission. I think Taub calls it Sovereignty and Submission. And then the subtitle is Will Americans Rule Themselves or Be Ruled by Others? And Fonte is PhD from University of Chicago in world history. And then he becomes a senior fellow and director of the Center for American Common Culture at the Hudson Institute. He's also been at the American Enterprise Institute, where he directed the Committee to Review National Standards under the chairmanship of Lynn Cheney, a senior researcher at the U.S. Department of Education, National Endowment of the Humanities. And so there's something going on here in terms of the contradiction of this, this sort of, anti-Americanism that Fonte writes the article Anti-Americanization in AEI in 1996. He writes an article called Post-West Syndrome at AEI in 1997. And then at the same time, you have this Ron Dermer figure there, who is crucial to the 11/9 operation. And we now know that Trump was very much Russia involved there. And then when you combine that with the co-authorship of Ron Dermer with Natan Sharansky, who is a credibly accused Soviet police agent by some of the most well-respected and serious of the Israeli Soviet refuseniks, and basically used lawfare against a well-respected surgeon who was beginning to criticize not only his own medical field. This is Yuri Nudelman, who's not only beginning to criticize his own medical field, but also the treatment, the use of the military in terms of, Palestinians and all of that. And he and Noodleman in his lawfare with Sharansky, who the overt facts are known, replete through things like late great Jewish American journalist Robert Friedman's book, The Red Mafia, that Sharansky was deep in bed with the Russian deep state in terms of the Russian organized crime and bringing in millions of dollars of backing, connecting it with Netanyahu, and basically being installed at these commanding heights in Israel. And then it comes out that he is suspected by his fellow, apparent fellow Soviet refuseniks in Israel as being a police agent who ratted them all out to the Soviet authorities. And then there's a deeper question about whether it was just ratting them out, or whether the fact that Sharansky was then brought, out of the Soviet Union in a spy swap, a recognized spy swap, where the United States gave up Czech super spies working for the Soviet Union in a swap for some Jewish refusenik in the Soviet Union, not alleged to be a spy. So Dermer, the combination of his co-authorship with this suspected long-term Soviet police informant at the very least, and then maybe potentially a long-term actor in the form of Natan Sharansky, the go-to guy for the war on terror justification by the Bush administration and quote-unquote intervention into Iraq. And then also Dermer, this key Netanyahu-Trump guy, helped facilitating and helping the communications going on, I think really puts at the very least, the irony, if not the hypocrisy, if not the lie, to this entire engagement of Shapiro and Peterson in Jerusalem. And then the cherry on top, of course, is this is Epstein Lawyerville once again, as we pointed out when we were at the Trump rally in Iowa in early 2020.
Yeah.
More Epstein lawyers.
Yeah.
More Epstein lawyers. This is what got the young MAGA heads in front of us to
Yeah.
turn around and look at us with the
And there was a
scales.
guy, there was also a guy standing in proximity to us wearing an InfoWars shirt and a MAGA hat, and he didn't say anything to us, but I wonder what he was thinking, because he would have understood what that meant. I don't know about the other young guys, but he would have had to understand what we're talking about. But it's interesting. A deep dive might be required on somebody like Ron Dermer at some point in the future, but he's a very interesting character. He's born in Miami to obviously Zionist parents, and he was a student of Frank Luntz's at the University of Pennsylvania. Luntz described him as the
Wow.
most talented student I've ever had. And while he was at Oxford, he started working on polling for Natan Sharansky when Sharansky was involving himself with Israeli politics in the mid-'90s. And he's been a long-term, protege of Natan Sharansky. We also, Jeremy, I believe we identified Ron Dermer sitting behind then soon to be Minister of Finance in the Israeli government under Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu, in his testimony to Congress in fall of 2002 about selling the Americans on the need to go to war in Iraq, again, to remove Saddam Hussein. We had identified Dermer sitting behind Netanyahu, and then he goes on to co-author this Case for Democracy by Natan Sharansky. Dermer himself's a very interesting character, and he was right in the midst of all of this 11/9 moment, as the Israeli ambassador to the United States from 2013 to 2021, and Dermer currently is the Minister of Strategic Affairs in the new Netanyahu government. So Dermer is a very interesting guy, and he's has a close proximity to both Sharansky and Netanyahu, and he was right there in the center of things, right at the heart of 11/9, everything that came with it.
And that moment in 2002 of Netanyahu coming to the U.S. Congress as a very almost a bully pulpit agitator for the Iraq War, and remember that this was actually done. That was supposed to be a panel, I think, of Israeli opinion. It was probably supposed to be diverse, a diversity of opinion on the Iraq War. And now there's even some aspect of like that people like Ariel Sharon were originally against the Iraq War as too dangerous because it would facilitate Iranian influence in the region, and that the real focus should be Iran. But then he was then brought into the mix more to with the Netanyahu types, and then of course it's Sharon who sets up the key Israeli. I'd call it war criminal terror cell that meets the U.S. Version of it in terms of the Office of Special Plans, the Office of Special Investigations. I think that's the other one that's involved in the manufacture of the deception to create the Iraq War. And so this is you know a transnational operation where you have then the convinced. Sharon in Israel helping actually manufacture the intelligence to some extent, and then this cell at the heights of the Pentagon, attached to the Pentagon via people like Douglas Feith, and I can't remember the name of the guy at the OSI who was brought up by that director of the Catherine Gunn documentary.
Oh, name was almost on the tip of my tongue there, Jeremy.
All right, it's all right. We'll loop back to that. But then that was then the manufactured intelligence
Abram
v.
Schultz, Jeremy.
Shulsky. Thank you very much, Greg. And so then that crew from Shulsky to Feith, and then all the people surrounding that
Michael Maloof.
acted. Who?
Michael Maloof, of course.
Michael
He's
Maloof.
favorite guy.
That was then they then injected the manufactured intelligence into the American government and the American media to create that. But this moment of public agitation by Netanyahu at the time is usually forgotten, and it's a crucial one because it ends up not being a diversity of opinion of the Israeli government, let alone the Israeli society, in terms of the question of war with Iraq. It's just Netanyahu browbeating the Congress, and then, as you pointed out, this key factor of Dermer in the background, basically acting almost like as this intellectual body man
Uh,
for this scenario where Netanyahu is bodying the U.S. Congress.
one more thing about Dermer in this Netanyahu Jordan Peterson interview. I guess maybe this is obviously the Americanness of Dermer coming out. That Netanyahu credited Dermer with selling Trump on the Abraham Accords by using golf analogies. So that was very heartwarming.
Yeah, all right, and that just as Netanyahu had masterminded this runaround of the question of the solving the Palestinian problem first as the pathway to peace, he says, "No, we're going to build our power. Then we'll bring the Arab governments to our table, and then if the Palestinians want to sit down, under our, we'll bring them in." Or something like that. And the way he has Dermer describe it to, or maybe Dermer came up with this on his own, right? Of describing it to Trump as that, that the putt for the bringing the palace through the Palestinians, because Netanyahu actually describes it in his interview with Peterson of that Trump was actually too interested in the Palestinian way forward. And you actually heard that in early Trump administration rhetoric that Trump was saying, we're going to make a deal. We're going to make sure the Palestinians, are at the table and all of that. And then that is given way after this Dermer golf analogy of the putt to bring the Palestinians into the peace deal is like a 150-foot putt through a brick wall. Why don't we just do the 30-foot putt, which is the Abraham Accords, and
Mhm.
bringing the Israeli government into the Arab local mainstream?
And I think the combination of these golf analogies and the fact of who Trump long term is ultimately owned by, I mean, these long term connections would inevitably mean Trump would fall in this direction. But then I also think that the whole idea of Trump wanting to, the deal, I'm gonna be the greatest president ever. We're gonna have the deal to end all deals is that's just part of his personality of wanting to be the guy to get the credit for things more than it was any type of like actual, you know, care in the world for Palestinians. But when push came to shove, ultimately, a combination of his long term connections and obviously the people, the Trump whispers right there in his ear to sell him on this based on golf analogies, it was pretty inevitable where he'd ultimately go. But I do think the that was part of his narcissistic egotism that I think people had to temper ultimately. The idea that, oh, I'll be good for both sides because people will give me credit for the greatest deal ever. And ultimately, you see where he fell, I think, inevitably.
Definitely. And there's one more data point that I want to bring up in relation to Gadi Taub before we move on. But I also then remember that one other little data point that I have, that this question of the Iraq war and the Israel lobby, and specifically Netanyahu, and then I would suggest the combination of 9/11 and 11/9 being these Achilles heel, especially for a figure like the Prime Minister Netanyahu, is the fact that I believe it was on his Hoover Institute, the one in Stanford University. That's an interesting interview that he did, and I believe it's in that interview where he. This is, remember, Netanyahu is the son of a historian. He takes his role as a historian seriously. He proclaims it to Jordan Peterson about his memoir and his book and his books more generally, that he says no one has ever seriously contended with any fact that I've ever printed. It. I'm very serious about getting my facts straight. And then he talks about his dad, not only this sort of what he proclaims to be this incredible, charismatic speaker for post Herzl Zionism, or that's his grandfather, right? His grandfather was a Polish sort of instigator for Zionism and public speech. And of course, Netanyahu also then doesn't talk about how there was this question of Jabotinsky, right? There's a familial relationship with Jabotinsky that's not brought into the mix. But then his dad becomes a major historian, and his dad also was an activist, a Zionist activist in the United States, where that he says he gets a lot of his ideas about not only appealing to the principle or the moral righteousness of the Jews reclaiming their historic homelands and all of that in America, but appeal to the statesmen in terms of interest, and that's where this question of power and dynamics come up in terms of Netanyahu's approach. And all throughout these conversations he's having, this is the pole that he sets up. He calls it, I think he talks about the tension. He calls it the tension between principles and interests, right? And so that's what he's talking about. He's trying to appeal to both people who believe in Zionism for what they think are moral reasons, but also those who would believe in it pragmatically in terms of their own national or self-interest. And that's, of course, then what his whole move in terms of the Talpiot program and the rolling out of this economic sector and the Abraham Accords and all of that is in relationship to what he sees as appealing to other people's interests. And just one aside that I remember in terms of this is that to me it felt like the historically American idea of beware of trading liberty for security, where in this case liberty is the principle and security is the interest. But Netanyahu puts it forth as a balancing act rather than a both and kind of scenario, and so he's willing to trade one for the other at certain times in relationship to other people. But historically, because his dad's this historian, he proclaims himself to be, a serious historian who's also a statesman. In this Hoover Institute interview, he can't even remember the year when the Iraq War happened. And for someone like that to just blank out on it, he talked about 2005 or something. And I just got the sense that there's a very big, almost subconscious kind of blind spot to this time. I would say 2001 to 2003, where Netanyahu is deeply vulnerable to of being exposed as a key operative in these crucial and destructive moments for the United States, 9/11 and the Iraq War. And so, in the larger picture of this Daily Wire Tikva Institute Jerusalem Gabfest scenario with Peterson and Shapiro and Taub, this Israeli, philosopher type, trying to market his sort of, we need to go with this real neocon rather than the paleo neocon type, and putting it into American interests. I get more and more of the sense, and then Netanyahu's boy Dermer, this crucial character there, as we pointed out, there is the vulnerability there. Is figure out that Achilles heel and go right to it in terms of the facts and the analysis. Expose the Israel lobby's role in the Iraq War, and specifically Netanyahu and his network in the Iraq War, and then additionally Netanyahu and 9/11. And then I would then go into the question of Israeli military intelligence and Epstein, with the institute that has an Epstein lawyer on the board. And so, of course, these are the areas that real serious independent media would focus on when bringing up things like Ben Shapiro and Daily Wire and Jordan Peterson or Epstein even. And I would say more and more, these needs to be the markers of people who are not your true friend. Oh, I was going to say the last point about Gadi Taub, the data point, is that there was he wrote an article that was posed as an interview with Steve Bannon for Haaretz, sort of the liberally kind of Israeli newspaper. And the title of it is Steve Bannon tells Haaretz why the Russians aren't the bad guys and why he can't be an anti-Semite. The architect of Trump's 2016 victory may no longer work in the White House, but he has no hard feelings. He's convinced that America under Trump is undergoing a revolution, and Judeo-Christian culture is being pulled back from the brink, and the left is in total meltdown because it knows it's just the beginning. And then he gets major pushback internally in Israel, even for this interview. And so I think this is a crucial piece to consider in terms of really understanding the deeper dynamics of what this network is all about in terms of, Bannon, Breitbart, made in America, conceived in Israel, Netanyahu right there at the table there behind
And
Breitbart and Jim Hoft and all that.
I would add in what you have been referring to more recently. Wasn't it the Israelis on 9/11? Give us 20 years.
Well, okay.
Or what was that exactly? Where did that quote come from exactly?
All right. Yeah,
20
yeah,
years
yeah.
to control your media, basically.
Yes. All right. Let's deal with that too, Greg, because we should deal with the larger network here in terms of, all right, you have obviously there's this very strong Israeli component to the Daily Wire, and with Ben Shapiro as the guy there, he's the lone editor emeritus of the entire site. It's his site. The Wilkes brothers obviously backed him, but now they sort of turned it into this mega machine, some kind of a Disney for the new right media. But then you have this, the Daily Wire Plus, which is just last year created these re-upping and amplifying their deal with PragerU. So once again, I'll point out PragerU is run is the chief executive officer of PragerU is an Israeli military intelligence officer, an information warfare officer, obviously in terms of NSA, at least communications warfare of some sort, an intelligence officer, Marissa Straight. But then there's this much larger dynamic going on here in terms of activating this kind of part of the global, allegedly populist left and right in terms of the rebel media's recent. They're sort of like the new True News at Davos. Remember, True News was given access to Davos during the Trump years. So you basically have the sort of the anti Jewish, Davos dissident media type in the Juku, Rick Wiles, and True News and all of that. And now you have the very pro Zionist and very Jewish rebel news making its way to Davos and confronting the CEO of Pfizer on the streets about the COVID-19 vaccine, and so what you have is the main assistant reporter there, who is there with Ezra Levant, who's the long-term rebel media guy, who, by the way, was like there. That's the core of like the media attack on Kevin Barrett's alleged compatriot Tony Hall, in terms of ousting Tony Hall from his university in relationship to the B'nai B'rith Canada and all of that. And Rebel Media read some of the most effective and major hit pieces against Tony Hall during his struggles, or at least it was funded by Rebel Media. But this main guy who's asking questions of the Pfizer CEO alongside Ezra Levant as they're walking down the street in Davos next to the big Palantir sign, for example, or the maybe BlackRock sign, or the Saudi, the MBS hangout operation up there, is a guy named Avi Yemini. And Avi Yemeni is on Twitter as an Ozraeli. He is also an IDF veteran, and with a very quote unquote troubling background, we might say. And so all of this begin to remind us of this what is. I believe this comes from FBI investigations after 9/11 in relationship to the urban moving systems Israeli intelligence spy network, some of those which are known then as the celebrating Israelis, who were, seen videotaping, high-fiving, flicking lighters, celebrating the attack on the World Trade Center. But there's this much deeper part, which includes not only one moving system, one moving company that's a front for Israeli intelligence, but probably at least three. But this urban moving systems company was headed up by Dominique Suter. And I believe the FBI investigation found that some of the people who worked in specifically Israelis who were working in urban moving systems had been said to have told their non-Israeli workmates that give us 20 years and we'll take over your media, they said, in terms of the United States, Israeli versus United States or something like that. And so it's hard to not see exactly that in terms of what we're really seeing around all this sort of new right media. There seems to be an IDF officer everywhere you look.
Right, and we've said this for the past several years, and I still believe it. The symbolism. I mean, I think it was more than symbolism of Breitbart, Made in America, conceived in Israel, being the Death Star, as you called it, for the 2016 operation with Gateway Pundit, which I think still flies under the radar of Jim Hoft and the Hoft brothers, right there at the table with Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course that spawned people all the way from Ben Shapiro, who we're talking about now, to the likes of Lee Stranahan, who's gone on to be the Russian mouthpiece for Sputnik. And it's interesting also that I don't think two things about that, little side tangents, but two things about that. Number one is obviously these Israelis, this was actually said, was they didn't believe the conventional logic among the American white nationalist neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call them at the time, that the Jews, quote unquote, already controlled the media because they didn't believe that it had actually been done. That's one thing. And then also, this would not have been done without this multinational move that with Russia right at the center of. And so it's interesting that this actual what might be called like a takeover of of the most influential media that is the new media that is directly influencing your politics, of course, right hand in glove with Fox News, the neocon, I would say now subversive media outlet that of course came to so much prominence to such a disastrous scale during the Bush years and on. Actually the outlet that is most influencing the significant element of the voting populace that goes in the direction of Donald Trump and this takeover of the United States, I'd say, that took place there. This first coup and then the second attempted coup on January 6th wouldn't have happened without this very overtly direct Russian role. So it's very fascinating with hindsight to see that. And that was just an observation I had about this whole we'll take over your media if you give us 20 years. Well, 15 years approximately looks like, and it was done with a multinational effort with Russia right at the center of it.
Yes, and then when you then factor in how frontal like the Russian sphere is in at the very least like working with the culture war, and more so in terms of the history that you've pointed out in terms of this much longer decades long relationship with aspects of the Russian sphere with the some of the earliest of the culture warriors in the United States. And then when you then see the way that this is going down right now, where you have someone like Avi Yemini, this Israeli, proud Israeli, who's right by, I mean, now they're getting like, millions and millions and millions of views in terms of their interview with the Pfizer CEO and confronting him about the vaccine and how they lied about how it didn't stop transmission, and shouldn't he, return money to people and all of that. That this guy is like his background is perfectly situated in terms of his rhetoric for the core of the culture war and the way it's been deployed by in the Trump sphere. Like for example, we'll include a link to an article at the Bragg Media titled "Everything You Need to Know About Avi Yemini" from July 2021. He's a far right social media personality who is known for creating controversy, but who exactly is proud Israeli Avi Yemini, by Jessica Lynch. Now, he said, now it's, quote, known for his extreme right wing ideology and controversial comments, including calling Islam a quote unquote barbaric ideology and saying that Muslim countries are Islamic shitholes. Yemeni, who once served as a sniper in the Israel Defense Forces and is a proud Zionist, has had quite the checkered past when it comes to political controversy and run ins with the law. And there's a whole bunch underneath here, but we'll just sort of like note these two big things of where he was actually sued by his own brother, who is called a yeshiva center child sexual abuse whistleblower, Manny Wax, after he publicly accused his family of harboring a pedophile at their home, which is referring to a child sex offender, Rabbi Moshe Keller, who his brother didn't know at the time. And it's very interesting that his brother is actually a whistleblower, it looks like, in a similar kind of way that you have whistleblowers within the Catholic Church, who it's very difficult under the institutional power to for a victim to blow the whistle on these on Catholic priests, for example. Now you have someone within the yeshiva center community blowing the whistle on a child sex offender rabbi, and his brother, who's obviously some kind of hateful culture warrior of some sort, basically undermines him. And then he additionally has been accused of like throwing a cutting board at a girlfriend or wife or something like that. And so this is now who's being featured as like the next generation of We Are Change or something like that, of confronting these powerful people on the streets of Davos. But really, when you look at it, with the rhetoric, you're really just talking about the new True News and the way that they operated in relationship to Trump, the chief shitholer himself.
Yeah, and where they come together. I mean, remember, and I'll mention this briefly, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of final points about the Netanyahu interview. remember where they line up is before Rick Wiles became this blame the Jew religious crusader during the Trump era. It was all about Islam and how Islam was going to destroy the West, and basically sounding like exactly what these people sound like and still sound like now, until it shifted to going from the Muslims to the Jews. And of course that's seems pretty par for the course for someone who got on the map setting up satellite contracts for Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network and the Trinity Broadcasting Network. So I mean that's a pretty natural evolution. But yeah, they up until a few years ago sounded just like the likes of Avi Yamini when it came to the Muslims and the barbarism of these people and how they're going to destroy us if we don't keep them under control. So, and did you want to say anything else before we finish up with a couple more points about the Netanyahu interview?
No, let's get into the Netanyahu interview. I mean, there's way more to discuss around the sort of weaponization of COVID and the response and stuff like that, and we'll deal with some of that more down the road because that's a crucial other piece of the culture war in many ways.
Right. And so you mentioned already, Jeremy, the Netanyahu, it sounded like basically like admitting to what Seth calls the Red Sea conspiracy when talking about the trip and the being courted by these leaders after his congressional speech. A couple other things we noticed in this were one was, and this is going back to the earlier conversation about the fusion of, or the coming together of the synchronizing of the long-term American domestic economic domestic policies of the think tanks of the think tanks and the quote unquote intellectuals and economic policy. And you mentioned we'll even talk about this in the future, probably at some point, going back to the prevailing influence of the Chicago School, the infusion of that with the culture wars on a global scale and this push for this hardline global quote unquote nationalism. Netanyahu mentioning how he had to get the basically get the sector, get the economy under control by cutting back on the welfare programs and the Bedouins and their I forget if he said 6 kids or 60 kids, but these Bedouins with 6 kids getting these benefits and driving BMWs around. It very much was very similar to that was a example of like the role of like the Netanyahus in terms of the bringing the free market, quote unquote, that's been pushed by these American domestic interests for decades into Israel, and now this fusioning further on a global scale, fusioning of the global culture war with the hardline shift in Israel, combined with what's going on in America and these long-term sought-after domestic policies that are bringing together these long-term goals and policies with this new push for nationalism, quote unquote, on a global scale. And the other
And
thing,
Greg,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, who was it that you said had called like in relationship to like Gates talking about the welfare issue, and we just recently saw like a Tucker Carlson thing about talking about the assault on menthol cigarettes and basically dog whistling it, give the poor black people their comfort and stuff like that. That's sort of like the thing. Let's not have a social safety net system. Let's just allow the poor black people to have their menthol
Oh,
cigarettes
yeah.
and crystallize their lungs. But you had said that someone had called Zelensky the global welfare queen or something.
Oh, it was it was Matt Gaetz didn't directly say it, but Charlie Kirk directly referred to Zelensky as the global welfare queen. And that reminds me, is that what you're thinking of, Jeremy?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, and then one more thing I'll mention here real quick is this is a coming together of some elements of these Israeli interests with obviously TP USA, TP in my bunghole USA, Beavis and Butthead reference.
TP
Sorry.
my bungle.
Of obvious Zionist youth organization, basically, of what it is on the college campuses, and further infusioning itself into secondary school curriculums of
And by the way, the whole TimCast, including Luke, they were all there, like you sort of yakking it up with the TP for my bunghole USA crew.
right. But that's one area where the rhetorical similarities come together in terms of the common policy pushing with Charlie Kirk. This, I would say, very much a seems like a Zionist operative in the U.S. It might be more than that, but definitely very Zionist friendly. Turning Point USA group, calling Zelensky the global welfare queen. He did an interview with, I think he did a full interview with Tucker Carlson for his Fox Nation program, I think it was, where basically both were in concurring agreement that the same people who took us to war in Iraq are the same people who want to cut your genitals off so you can have a sex change operation.
which Greg, we'll include the links here. We won't go into it so much right now, but it reminds me again of how high level the Russian sphere propaganda, talking about quote unquote global homo, and this is interesting article at the Hill called "The Gay World Order Inside Putin's Warped Reality," that actually references like serious players, serious billionaire oligarch players. Some of them are like some of the closest personal people to Putin, using these kinds of talking point that lights up like these sort of pseudo alternative media, people like the Kevin Barrett's and False Flag Weekly News and all of his co-hosts and all of that, in terms of the sort of at least these guys are super real woke. They're talking about global homo and the global gay world war and all of that kind of thing. And we'll include the links to some of these guys like Yuri Kovalchuk and Kirill Shamalov. This is the network, and they're very, very close to Putin, and they're doing these interviews that really light up these very highly weaponized and controlled aspects of the American alternative media system.
Yeah, good point. And the last part of this, the last element of this Netanyahu Jordan Peterson interview we wanted to point out was the manner in which Netanyahu spoke about Palestine prior to the setup of the Jewish state, and very similar to, and you pointed this out, that this is where the topic of settler colonialism comes in, which you hear from, anti-imperialists, from leftists, and similarities to the way that certain elements of the American nationalist crowd talk about America. Oh, we came in and there was nothing here, and it was just, there was no civilization. It was all, so there's a merging together here of points of the Zionist project with the what became the term manifest destiny used, that it's your destiny to control this land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And then what is it in Israel? Greater Israel is supposed to be from the Nile to the Euphrates. You've got the Atlantic to the Pacific and the manifest destiny. Of course, that's one thing also that's going to be lost in these attacks on any type of teaching that I think that's critical of the conventional American history that makes you feel good. The idea that we're this exceptional country, and that's another thing I think is going to be lost, is critical teaching of the things that led to the America as we know it today, and even trying to counterbalance the problems with the good and the bad of our history. And that's going to be one thing that's lost with that thing. But very similar sounding Netanyahu here with the way he talked about there was nobody here. And you can talk about some of the contradictions and the reality of that, but real quick before we wrap up. But sounding very similar to the Americans who talk about how there was nothing here before we came, and we had to take it over because it was unsettled, and the savages and all of this.
Definitely, and this is where you really see like the political reasons for the culture war rhetoric. I think that goes beyond just its ability to create chaos and political division and destruction. That it's actually serving a very specific purpose in terms of the rhetoric of someone like Netanyahu, because this interview, people really might want to listen to this whole interview that's on YouTube with Jordan Peterson and Netanyahu, because it lays out really the whole scenario of all of these major points that Netanyahu is making. And of course, throughout all of his interviews, he is unabashedly, a smooth talking salesman for his book, is the one way that he talks about it. And he's unabashed about it. He's unembarrassed about it. But remember, this is the same guy who is also not only a furniture salesman in his American days, but this is the salesman of the war on terror, all the way back to the Jerusalem conference at the very latest, in terms of 1979, and the how the West can win terrorism, how the West can win and all the way up to the question of World Trade Center, Ground Zero, 9/11. These two Sayeret Makal special forces guys, and actually, it's in this interview that they talk about. Jordan Peterson brings up the Netanyahu's role background as a special forces IDF Sayeret Makal soldier, and Bibi fully embraces and talks about how all of his adventures as a special forces operative and operating behind enemy lines. So once again, I always remember Netanyahu not only selling furniture or selling his book, but Netanyahu in the U.S. Congress selling the Iraq War, or Netanyahu, let's say, on the phone with Larry Silverstein, maybe selling 9/11, and then his also previous commander in Sayeret Matkal, Ehud Barak, key close guy to the Israeli military intelligence, very close at the very least, Epstein Network, on BBC News, talking about the war on terror. Basically saying this is Bin Laden. There will be troops on all around the world, and this will go on for a long time. So put those two together, and you see a salesmanship where the question of just books and furniture is just the very, very tip of the iceberg in terms of what they're selling. And so Netanyahu, like they start out there, and the question of like erasing a people's history is crucial to all of this. And then the sort of the painting of this sort of savage population. He even tries to almost pretend like there were not really Palestinians there in Palestine, as the Zionist project was taking hold. He almost doesn't even mention that they're there. He calls it a barren land, seems to say that it's a barren land of not only of human beings, but also a barren land of any human interaction with the land. And so then you get into these real deep archetypes that are much more related to longer term notions of settler colonialism. Even though Netanyahu makes a real severe case of sort of, Peterson says he's going to push back against Netanyahu, but he's not prepared to push back against Netanyahu. And I'll just say, Peterson, I think, is a very interesting intellectual, and he's a serious intellectual when it comes to the questions of history of thought, the depth psychology, the question of spirituality and science in relationship to the human experience and role in the world. But when it comes to politics, he is just almost a know nothing, and an easy dupe who's just sort of like sets up Netanyahu to sucker punch straw man arguments rather than actually push back. But he sort of sets it up for these arguments of what's sort of intended to be like what Gadi Taub was referring to in terms of Fonte's reference to the Durban conference, of all these sort of woke leftists out there who might try to sort of conspire with the UN to take over America. Maybe it's not going to be blue helmets and the whole Alex Jones, John Birch, earlier conspiracy theories and all of that. But it's something about a culture war where the Durban left activists and these human rights activists and the UN are going to take over the American political system to some extent, or something like that. And so Netanyahu seems to like really be vigorously push back against that straw man, by saying we are not similar to these European settler colonial projects. Of course, he leaves out the United States. He doesn't want. There's a lot of delicate pussyfooting around the American experience, and then also the British relationship. I see, but he says we're not the Dutch in South Africa, and so he goes through a whole series of like, we're not this kind of settler colonial case. That we came back to our spiritually and historically lawful homeland, and there was basically no one there. There was a few squatters in this apartment that we built and that used to be ours, and we were pushed out. We were unrighteously evicted from our previous spiritual apartment in this land. And now we see ourselves with these sort of scattering of squatters in this barren land where they've just destroyed our apartment and all of that. And so this aspect of barren land and the main justification that Netanyahu makes, the second most important justification he makes is this is we're the sort of the first squatters of this land. This we have eminent domain because we were here first or something like that. That's sort of the sort of subsidiary argument. But the main argument he makes is that it's related to like trying to appeal to things like common law of that someone who doesn't use their land, if someone squats on the land and does something quote unquote productive with the land, then they become the rightful holder of that land. And so in the background you have the echoing of this whole notion of the savage in a certain way, and really like the way that the Native Americans were described by American colonizers in terms of haven't done anything with this bountiful land, and and also Netanyahu makes a sort of an appeal to principle in terms of the Jews. We are the ones who are the epicenter of moral history. It's the Ten Commandments that were the first and have become the foremost layer of morality in the world. And it all of it feels very similar to like this idea of that the Native Americans did not they did not cultivate their land, or they didn't have a productive relationship with their land. And of course, in so doing, by trying to accuse the Palestinians, which you're right, Greg, he starts out by saying the so-called Palestinians. This is Zionist 101, is linguistic genocide. That's what they are most serious. This is the most disciplined aspect that they carry out of the global Hasbara, or Hasbara, I don't know how to pronounce it, Hasbara propaganda guide, is to actually not use the word Palestinian. Always call them the Israeli Arabs and all of that. Now, eventually, Netanyahu, later in the conversation, actually, when he gets past the sort of I'm going to dog whistle on principle the fact that there is no Palestinian, let alone a Palestine, he then talks about, all right, well, eventually, if the Palestinians want to come to the table under under our rules, then we will discuss it with them after we do this whole Abraham Accords thing and exert our technical and economic power across the entire globe and basically force them to the table or something like that. And so there is this real serious thing of like this barren land. But of course, he does not mention Jerusalem, right? It's the Al Aqsa Mosque. That is beautiful architecture at the very least. He totally leaves out the actual Palestinian villages and how they were living with the land. And the biggest example, I would say, of this, of productive land, and remember this massive symbol of the Israeli bulldozers, right? The Israeli bulldozers. Not only did they kill, Rachel Corrie, a young American girl who was in, principal opposition to the treatment of the Palestinians by the Israelis, but the Israeli bulldozers also bulldoze the olive groves that the Palestinians have maintained for generations. It's many, the Palestinian olive groves on that land, on that quote unquote barren land, are many times older than even like Zionism as a political movement is. Okay, and so there is this savagization almost of the Palestinians when he finally even calls them Palestinians. It's very related to the idea of sort of like you know. You can't prove that someone is using land productively until they start building Dubai-style high-rise buildings and invite, worldwide corporations into, building your infrastructure or something like that. And so this is a piece of it. And then one last thing I thought of is that going back to our last recording from yesterday, where I pointed out that what became of LACAM or LACOM, this key, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, basically, that's probably the highest level technological espionage grouping in the Israeli government since the beginning. And people who were agents include Arnon Milchan, of course, the producer of JFK for Oliver Stone, and maybe the key Lacom agent for at least maybe a, a couple decades in terms of acquiring for the Israeli state missing material, especially NBC material, nuclear, biological, chemical. Milchan has his origins in a industrial agriculture company, so you're thinking about chemicals and all of that and that intersection there. And that's really usually how like the Israelis are painting it in this Netanyahu idea of the barren land. Whereas like there's lots of permaculture continuing to go on in the Palestinian sectors of how do you maintain and improve land, including silviculture, meaning like tree-based agriculture and perennial agriculture, rather than always plowing, which the Israelis sort of point to as their big success, right, of greening the deserts by the question of input intensive agriculture. Now, there's all kinds of other approaches that don't leave the land barren per se. So just back to Milchan and Lacam. Milchan sort of acquiring missing material for the highest levels of the Israeli security state, nuclear, biological, chemical. Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, he was also a Lacam agent working. That's one of the reasons why he was this key guy to use his American agent, high-level Senator John Tower, to put the backdoored Promise software into the U.S. nuclear establishment. This is Lacam, and what became of Lacam, as I pointed out yesterday, after the Pollard affair, it was basically retired because Pollard looks like he was being handled out of Lacam. And so what it became, they basically ended it, and then they re-establish this function of the Science Affairs Bureau, or the Bureau of Scientific Relations, aka LACOM, under the Director of Security of the Defense Establishment, or the Ministry of Defense Security Authority, MALMOB. That is then, I'll just read from the Wikipedia page, and we'll include this in the links. It's a department. Malmob is a department in the Israeli Defense Ministry that responsible for the security of the defense ministry, Israeli weapons industries and institutions, in dealing with development and production of weapons of mass destruction, and defensive centers such as the Negev Nuclear Research Center, the Israeli nuke, JFK, that whole scenario, Arnon Milchan, the JFK film, Oliver Stone. What's not in that film? What is in that film is shadowy figures from the CIA and the military-industrial complex. Very few with actually any nameable, specificity. But what's definitely not in that Lacom agent executive-produced film is anything about the question of the Israeli or nuclear program and the tension there with John Kennedy and Ben Gurion and all of that. Okay. So back to the description of the Malmob, Ministry of Defense Security Authority, which is the sort of new home of what had been Lacom. Israeli weapons industries and institutions in dealing with development and production of weapons of mass destruction, and defensive centers such as the Negev Nuclear Research Center, Israel Institute for Biological Research. And aside here, who was the basic, looks like to be like the first person who pointed the finger towards the quote unquote lab leak theory of COVID? It looks like it was Danny Yotam, a colonel, I think maybe a lieutenant colonel from the Israeli Institute for Biological Research, which maybe we will return to when we then deal with the question of COVID origins, COVID quote unquote response, but also the way that the whole weaponization of the research into it and the public discourse is a key piece of the ongoing culture war. Back to mall mob description and military units engaged in these areas. The mall mob was established in 1958 under the leadership of Chaim Kermon, former Shin Bet officer. The mall mob investigates the function of the workers, security audits, certification of the exposer technology, corruption. Hey, Prime Minister, maybe the most corrupt prime minister ever in Israeli history, Netanyahu, and preventing leakage of classified information. Pollard, the back door to potentially the Soviet Union. The mall mob also operates as an intelligence agency, as the mall mob runs agents who are responsible for dealing with obtaining technological information and intelligence in foreign countries. This area was the responsibility of Science Affairs Bureau, but in 1986, after the Pollard affair, the LECAM powers were transferred. In 2007, Amir Kane was appointed as the director of security of the defense establishment instead of Yechiel Chorev, who was in this position for 21 years. And the reason I bring this up in relationship to Netanyahu and the linguistic genocide of the Palestinians that he is most insistent upon, the historical genocide of the Palestinian people that that Jordan Peterson allows him to manufacture on that interview, is that it's also within this establishment, mall mob, where it turns out that some of the research and the Israeli government papers that prove the Nakba and the ethnic cleansing intent at the origin of the Israeli state were covered up. But meanwhile, there's been much major historical analysis of what actually happened in terms of the birth of the Israeli state in an intentional ethnic cleansing operation that include mass terrorism, really. And I will include links to Wikipedia linkages to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That's sort of when the Israelis finally got to the table of this analysis. Someone like Ilan Pappé that talks about the ethnic cleansing and the intent at the time. But of course, as usual, there are Arab and or Palestinian voices who have been saying this for many, many years and doing major historical research. So that goes back to someone like Walid Khalidi in Plan Dalet, the Zionist master plan for the conquest of Palestine, and Nur el-Din Mashala in Expulsion of the Palestinians, the concept of quote-unquote transfer in Zionist political thought. Benny Morris is the sort of establishment Israeli historian who sort of helps sort of limit the hangout of all of this. But then, of course, then I would say, finishing up here, that not only this question of the linguistic and historical genocide of the Palestinians is obviously a crucial piece to what Netanyahu is doing, but once again, I'll say that this might also be an Achilles heel of his intellectual armor, I would say, but most especially, again, the questions of terror and war, the instigation of terror and war. And you got to come back to Iraq War, 9/11, global terror war, and then I would say then the connection to the Red Sea conspiracy that he's now admitted on the Daily Wire of getting on the yachts with the Arab leaders who then were connected to the Putin operation to install Trump, the 11/9 operation. So I just want to say that we got to focus on these Achilles heel while also, filling back in the truth that someone like Netanyahu tries to linguistically genocide.
I will wrap up a couple of quick final thoughts. Number one, it was Danny Shoham, Israeli military intelligence, who in the Washington had told the Washington Times Bill Gertz, who is a reporter who has been involved himself in some important narrative fitting stories over the years, that it came out of the leak, that it was likely a leak from a lab. And so that was from the pages from Israeli military intelligence to the Washington Times, and then I believe amplified by the likes of Tucker Carlson as well as Tom Cotton in the Senate. So that was where that originated from. It was Danny Shoham, Danyshhoham. And then also your final thought on the you mentioned where it's the Durban,
The Durban
yeah, it
conference.
was the global awareness maybe of a part of like the global awareness of like this push against like the global, rising liberalism and Durban conference and Zionism's racism, and later on the rise of um, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Whether it's Israelis, certain elements of the Israeli population concerned about growing global awareness of the Zionist depths of elements of the Zionist project on a mass public awareness scale, or whether it's Russians concerned about the global reaction to activities taken about by it, or whether it's Americans concerned about the erasure of its culture and there is a similar type of ideological pushback that leads to, I'd say, from an American-centric perspective, from a Russian-centric perspective, and from a Zionist-Israeli-centric perspective, that lead to the pushback against the rising tide of liberalism, of more diverse opinions, and shifting away from the types of support of the policies that would lead to the perpetuation of Zionism, or elements of the more, I would say, toxic elements, historical elements of American exceptionalism, or of Russian domestic and geopolitical projects, that leads to, I think, this shared animus towards liberalism, towards the global, the unipolar world, and that leads to things such as the global coming together, multinational scale, that brings us Brexit, that brings us Donald Trump, that brings us this rising tide of hardliners and quote unquote nationalism to push back against the liberalism and all that comes with it. So whether it's from an American perspective, whether it's from an Israeli Zionist perspective, or whether it's from a Russian perspective, there are similar strains that lead to this combined pushback that led us into, I think, that has helped lead us into the moments of 2016 and beyond to where we're at now.
Definitely, definitely, and there's a lot more here, I think, in terms of this relationship specifically, and why it would be that the Daily Caller and Shapiro's operation is like ends up doing the sort of capstone interview with Netanyahu. It's obviously the capstone interview. And I'm taken back again to some of the early shots fired in the culture war dynamics of the Trump operation, Trump election operation, 11/9 operation, in terms of Ben Shapiro, then at Breitbart, having been shown by Manafort criminal documents that Manafort washed Russian propaganda. It looks like about Timoshenko in Ukraine and connecting her to Hillary Clinton through some high-level minister in Israel. Some have said it looks like it could be Avigdor Lieberman. Always been questions of the Avigdor Lieberman's loyalties in terms of Israeli security services in Russia and his whole background there. But Lieberman was openly talked about this sort of the rise of the anti-Semitic leader of this anti-Semitic coalition that Timoshenko had created in Ukraine by creating an uncomfortable coalition with Svoboda. And remember, sort of like Euchre Nazi now, right, as the talking point for the justification of the Russian invasion, and how that all sort of came together in certain ways. But Manafort, on behalf of his Russian oligarch handlers in the Ukrainian sphere, and once again, you see Oliver Stone in the mix here, because one of them is one of the key guys in Oliver Stone's Ukrainian film, and we'll discuss some of these dynamics more later. But on behalf of Manafort's paymasters, they launder some anti-Semitic charges linking the Timoshenko. Remember, she's the original lock her up target of the Manafort sphere, via then some high-level minister in Israel. Could be Avigdor Lieberman, who at some point becomes the head of the Office of Strategic Affairs, which is Israel's global civil assassination unit. I think they would talk about it, even though it's also about just affairs, strategic affairs, right? And then moving it right into the heart of American politics via the Death Star Breitbart, and at that point, one of their star reporters, Ben Shapiro. And this is all in the Manafort's prosecution by Mueller. And then after that, then of course Shapiro breaks from Trump. He sort of disagrees in certain ways. He agrees in other ways. He's a fair critic of Trump. And then boom, with the rise of the new right Disney, Daily Caller, and this Tikva Jerusalem scenario, backed by the Epstein lawyer boarded organization, and then this Daily Caller that has incorporated obviously the strong Israeli focus, and then a Prager University part of their content run by a former Israeli military intelligence officer. So you got to think about these bigger dynamics here, especially when you throw in this Russian part, which again is why the totality of the 11/9 operation is still crucial. It's denied almost across the board in these spheres. Tim Pool is a total a belligerent know nothing in terms of the actual facts of Trump Russia, so called, let alone the question of the Red Sea conspiracy that Netanyahu is now admitted to on Daily Caller airwaves. So there's a lot here. There's tons to unpack, and hopefully I'll be more focused next time.
I think we've been much
Sorry.
more focused than we were on our last show. I will say that. And my final point is that Ben Shapiro, he's presented, and I don't think there's any significant evidence that Ben Shapiro is some type of Russophile or pro-Russian or anything like that. In fact, he portrays himself as being the opposite of that, and that opens him up to a lot of attacks from the more alt-right type of people among other reasons. But while Ben Shapiro now is not pushing these Russian-centric friendly messages, it's interesting. It's through the interconnected TPUSA, the Zionist college organization, who previously has had people like Candace Owens, who now moved to Daily Wire, and then of course the Daily Wire adjacent Prager University, which has significant correlation with Turning Point. And it's Charlie Kirk, who's a big ally of Ben Shapiro's, calling Zelensky the global, the uppity, there's a dog whistle for you, uppity international welfare queen. So while Shapiro's not directly pushing that himself, people very pretty close to him ideologically are pushing the evolved version of that same message, which goes from Nazi anti-Semites in Ukraine are being used by the Clinton State Department to the president of Ukraine as an international welfare queen.
All right, very good. And I will also include an article titled "From the Middle East Eye: Secret Israeli Unit Hiding Documents to Undermine History of Nakba." Report. An explosive investigation. Haaretz reports that Israeli defense officials have been sealing off historical files about the mass expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. So that will that's about Malbab and the former head of Malbab hiding them because he said the documents could, quote unquote, generate unrest among the Palestinians in Israel. So that I'll include that. And then it's also the case that there has been, I pointed out that there is this tension with the UK, it seems like, in terms of Netanyahu and Israel more generally. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about the background of Kim Philby, this notorious high-level Soviet spy who was also a Zionist spy. It looks like he was a Soviet spy first, then as the highest levels of the Soviet Union saw it geopolitically advantageous to support the Zionist project as a way to, to give the middle finger and to sort of push out the Western imperial powers from the Middle East. And Philby was a Zionist operative. And then that puts the whole question of the King David Hotel bombing into even more macro geopolitical question, and all of that. Um, but this question of the British, Netanyahu was obviously sort of a little bit. He was resentful around what he seemed to sort of call the alleged British promise, in the form of the Balfour document, in terms of that he said it was a promise for what they called a Jewish homeland, but everybody knew it was a Jewish state. And what, of course, he also didn't include in there because it would have gone against the grain of his thing of his propaganda of a land without people for a people without a land, and the barren land and the sort of scattered savage squatters in our historical God-given apartment scenario, is that he leaves out the other part of like the British agreement in relationship to the Zionists. And remember, a lot of this is also run through uh, Victor Rothschild's uncle, I think, was the key mover of the Balfour document, and that Victor Rothschild looks like he's actually above Kim Philby potentially in this Soviet spy cell. So that becomes very interesting. But this other piece of the British agreement with the Zionists, as declared by the Rothschild-goaded Balfour document, is that it will also include an allowance and a respect for the people already living on the land, aka the Palestinians. So, once again, Netanyahu, making his power moves in terms of history here. And there's a British question here. And so the last thing I want to point out is that a more recent historian, in terms of the question of the ethnic cleansing and Zionist intent around that, it looks to be Rosemary Esper in Under the Cover of War 2008, concurs with Ilan Pape and brings new arguments from British documents to support the thesis that the Exodus had been planned by the Yishuv leaders. So we'll include this Wikipedia content in that earlier article about the Mal Mob, the new umbrella organization for the Key Lakam industrial espionage organization, and its role in this piece of deception warfare in terms of erasing the ethnic cleansing history by the Israelis towards the Palestinians, and how that is held within some of the highest level of national security in Israel.
All right, I think with that we will wrap up for now, Jeremy. Thank you as always.
All right. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. Until next time, Antidote. We are out.